So how did I begin my activism 54 years ago? Well, it actually first started, I suppose, in 1963, when I was aged 11. I wasn't an activist then, but it was the point of my first political awareness. In that year, 1963, I heard about the bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, in the United States, where 4 young girls about my own age were murdered by white racists. I can remember as an 11-year-old child thinking to myself, how could anyone kill another human being, let alone 4 young girls in church on a Sunday morning? So that prompted my interest in and inspiration by the Black Civil Rights Movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King. I saw that struggle as a just struggle for freedom, for equality. And I felt so passionately that Black Americans were right to fight for their freedom. But of course, I was only 11 years old. I wasn't yet an activist. That took a bit later. It wasn't until I was 15, still at school, age 15 in 1967, that a man was about to be hanged in my hometown of Melbourne, Australia. He had allegedly shot dead a prison warder during a jail escape. And having read the reports about the scenario of the shooting, and in particular, the autopsy report on the dead warder's body, which was published in the newspapers, I worked out that from where the alleged killer, the escaped convict, was standing when he allegedly fired the fatal shot, and where the warder was standing when he was struck down, it would have been almost impossible for that bullet to have killed the warder, because it would have almost had to do a U-turn in midair, because the warder was chasing after the escaped convict. The convict allegedly fired, but the bullet entered the upper shoulder, back shoulder of the warder and exited through his lower abdomen. Now, that didn't make sense to me. Plus, of course, there was testimony by another warder who said that he believed the dead warder was shot accidentally during the firefight. So anyway, whatever the precise truth, I felt there was a reasonable doubt that this man, the escaped convict, did in fact murder that warder. So I believed because there was a reasonable doubt, he should not hang. My family lived way out in the suburbs. I only heard about the protests against his planned execution after they'd happened. But I wanted to do something myself. So at night, I used to go around my neighborhood and chalk gigantic slogans on walls and railway arches saying, "Save Ryan." His name was Ronald Ryan. That's all I could do, but I wanted to do something because I thought that he might be guilty, but there was a doubt about his guilt. Sadly, he was hanged anyway, despite all the protests, despite all the pleas for clemency. And that really shattered my faith and confidence in the government, the police, and the judiciary. I thought to myself, how could they hang a man where there was conflicting evidence and at least some doubt about his guilt? So it made me a lifelong skeptic of authority, and it prompted me to question other things that I'd taken for granted, such as the historic mistreatment of Indigenous First Australians, the Aboriginal people, such as Australia's involvement with the United States in the war in Vietnam. But it wasn't until 1969 that I realized I was gay, age 17. And that was another issue, because of course, homosexuality in the state of Victoria, Australia at the time was illegal and punishable by several years imprisonment. You could even be forced to undergo psychiatric treatment to cure your homosexuality in certain circumstances. So that made me very determined that I wanted to change things to make life better for LGBT plus people, to end criminalization, to end discrimination, to end hate crimes. Now, I was in late 1969 inspired by a report I read about a small gay liberation protest in New York. It was a news in brief. It simply said something like thousands of or hundreds of homosexuals marched through New York last night to demand equal rights. I thought to myself, wow, yes, that's what we need here in Australia. I want to be part of that. As well as fighting for Aboriginal rights and against the war in Vietnam, I want to fight for my rights as a gay man. But of course, at the time, there was no LGBT plus movement in Melbourne, Australia. There weren't even any LGBT plus advice and counselling services. There was absolutely nothing. So all I could do was write letters of protest to newspapers, to challenge homophobic reporting, to make the case for decriminalisation, and to challenge police harassment. Initially, I was too scared to even sign my name, let alone give my address, because I feared a policeman's knock on the door. But eventually, over time, I summoned up the courage and did eventually start signing my name and my address. I'm not too sure that any of my letters had much effect, but hey, they were an attempt to try and do something. And it's better to try rather than do nothing at all. So this prompted me, of course, to think to myself, well, how do we campaign for LGBT plus rights? Letter writing is fine, but what else can we do? And in the absence of an LGBT plus movement, I looked back to my knowledge and understanding of the Black civil rights movement in America. I saw how they did it. I learned about their historic struggle for Black rights. And so what I did was I adapted the ideas, the values, and the methods of the Black civil rights movement to the struggle for LGBT plus rights. But it wasn't until I actually came to London in 1971 that I had a chance to put those into practice. Because as I said, in Australia, in Melbourne, there was no LGBT plus movement. But when I arrived in London, not long previously, the Gay Liberation Front had been established. So I began to apply the ideas, the values, the methods of the Black civil rights movement to the activities and campaigns of the Gay Liberation Front. I can remember working out in my own mind, even before I came to London, back when I was 17, if Black people are an oppressed minority, and they are, if they deserve equal rights, and they do, then LGBT plus people, we are also an oppressed minority, and we also deserve equal rights. I also remember calculating, based on the history of the Black civil rights struggle in America, that it would probably take about 50 years to win legal equality in Western countries like the United States, Australia, and Britain. And so it has turned out. It's been about 50 years, and we have more or less won all the major battles for LGBT plus rights in Western countries. But that was just a guesstimate. But I owed my guesstimate to analysing and studying the history of the Black civil rights movement in the US. So it was sort of my teacher and guide. And I think this is a tremendously important lesson for us all. The value in learning from and listening to others, other individuals, other movements, other campaigns, other communities. We can all listen and learn from each other. And that can make us collectively stronger. We also need to recognize the intersection of different peoples and different struggles. You know, Black people or LGBT plus people, we are not one homogeneous whole. We are heterogeneous, we're diverse. There are many different types of LGBT plus and Black people. And of course, there are LGBT and Black people who are the one and the same. There are LGBT people who are Black and Black people who are LGBT. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that we're not just one thing. We have multiple identities and experiences of class, experiences of age, experiences of sexuality and gender, of disability. There are lots of different ways in which we are different and lots of different ways in which we share things beyond our own individual experience. So if we look at an issue of belief, for example, we have people who are religious and those who are not. We have people who are on the left and those who are on the right. That diversity is part of the fabric of society. And I think we need to acknowledge that in order to be more effective and to understand those differences in order to work with them in ways that can empower us all. If we take an LGBT plus pride parade, for example, you will see people of all races, classes, genders, abilities, and beliefs. And I think that's fantastic. Likewise, if you look at the Notting Hill Carnival or Black Lives Matter, again, you will see people of all different views and beliefs, ages, genders, abilities. And I think this is our great strength. Diversity has been a great empowerment of social movements. And the more people we can draw into social movements, the more diverse we can make those movements, the stronger we are, the more united we are, the more effective we are. So when I look at Black history, I see, for example, many of its leading figures were LGBT. In the late 1960s, I was campaigning to free the Black Power activist Angela Davis, who had been framed by the United States government. And it later turned out that she was a lesbian. She was Black and a lesbian. And she has championed both LGBT plus rights and Black rights. She sees the different struggles as two sides of the same coin. Going back to the Black Civil Rights Movement, which inspired me in the early 1960s, we all know about Martin Luther King and the great March on Washington in 1963, where he made his "I Have a Dream" speech. But what many of us do not know was that the person, the influencer of Martin Luther King, who taught him the values of nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience, and who was the main organizer of that March on Washington, was Bayard Rustin, a Black gay man. He brought his gayness and his Blackness together in the struggle for Black civil rights. And later on, after the Stonewall Rebellion in 1969, became an advocate of LGBT plus rights as well. If we look at Malcolm X, we know now, thanks to new historical research, that in his early teenage and late teenage years, that he was bisexual. Malcolm X had sexual relations with men. Of course, when he converted to the Nation of Islam, as far as we know, he gave all that up. But again, it's very important to acknowledge that another great Black icon of Black power and Black emancipation, Malcolm X, had a bisexual past. If we look at the great Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, the many great Black poets, authors, playwrights, and musicians, we see so many of them were LGBT. I think of poets and writers like Langston Hughes, Richard Bruce Nugent. These were very, very, very significant figures in the great black cultural flowering of the 1920s, but they were also gay. So were some of the greatest black female singers of that era. Both Billie Holiday and Ma Rainey were bisexual. A bit later on, James Baldwin, one of the great chroniclers of black civil rights and black culture. James Baldwin was openly gay. So my point is that openly LGBT plus black people in America have been very, very prominent. Prominent in the black freedom struggle and prominent in the struggle for LGBT plus culture and rights. If I go back to the Gay Liberation Front that I joined in 1971 when I arrived in London, we were primarily an LGBT plus movement, but we also had a wider vision. Now, I don't think the word equality ever passed our lips. Our goal was liberation. We didn't want equality within an unjust and fundamentally flawed status quo. We wanted to change society for the benefit of everyone, including straight people, but also including black and working class people, women, disabled people and others. We saw all these different struggles as interconnected, and we believed that if we all worked together, we would help our common cause, that we would help collectively to liberate ourselves and each other. I'm very, very proud that the Gay Liberation Front was, I think, the only non-black organization to stand in solidarity with the Mangrove 9 black defendants who were on trial in the early 1970s. They had been framed by corrupt police officers. And you may have seen the TV program Small Axe, which tells the story of what they went through. But the Gay Liberation Front, because we recognized that there was a common struggle between all peoples, we stood in solidarity with the black community, and in particular, the Mangrove 9 in that era. Bring things more up to date. The Black Lives Matter movement, which is so important and done so much to raise awareness about not just police racism, but the legacy of colonialism and imperialism, and the ongoing discriminations and inequalities that black people face, including violence on our streets, including being framed by police, including being killed by police here in this country. You know, we all know about George Floyd and the many other African Americans murdered by the police in the US. But let's never forget that many black people here in Britain have also been killed in police custody, and hardly any police have ever been charged or prosecuted. What I find really inspiring about the Black Lives Matter movement is that 2 of the 3 co-founders were queer black women, Alicia Garza and Patrice Cullors. They are both proud black queer women who understand the connections or the interconnections between the black struggle and the LGBT plus struggle. So again, it's so important to acknowledge and recognize these interconnections, this intersectionality between different communities and movements. So I just want to finish by saying that we all come to the table with many different backgrounds, many different experiences. But for those of us who want to bring about social change, increasingly we recognize that we all have to work together to listen and learn from each other. And I'm very glad that just as I borrowed from the Black Civil Rights Movement to help advance LGBT plus rights, many black people also borrow from the LGBT plus movement to advance their rights. When I look back to the 1960s again, a good little example is in the 1960s, the US Black Power movement had a simple three-word slogan, "Black is beautiful," and indeed it is. And that was to counter the negative ideas associated with being black. Well, a little bit later, soon afterwards, the Gay Liberation Front in the United States and Britain had a similar but different three-word slogan, "Gay is good," to counter the idea, the popular idea, the consensus at the time, that gay is bad, and indeed mad and sad as well. Gay is good. It was like a revolution in consciousness, just like black is beautiful was for African Americans. Gay is good turned on its head the centuries of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, which said that being LGBT was bad, was wrong, was shameful. So as we go forward to enact even more social change, to build even a better society, let's remember that united we are stronger, that we come from different places, but we can work together to secure our common good. And I finish with my motto, which is, don't accept the world as it is, dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen. Thank you so much.